welcome back to the EPS Podcast, where everything is a primary source. I'm Eric Paul, and I'm joined today by Dan. He is a good friend of mine, and we're going to be discussing the 1985 movie Commando. So welcome to the podcast. I'm glad you could join.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here, Eric.
So when we were talking about potential topics for this, we tossed around the idea of just talking about people in general. Are people a primary source? Are human beings a primary source? And we got around to just changing our mind to then, well, why don't we focus on, a movie made by one of the greatest specimens of humans, Arnold Schwarzenegger. And so we landed on Commando.
Yeah, his greatest film.
It's easily his best picture. And what I like about it is that because the year before is when he had made The Terminator, and a couple years before that was he was introduced on the movie scene. Well, the documentary Pumping Iron, but around that time is Hercules in New York, right. Which had the similar sound quality that I have right now. And and then after he did Commando, he went on to do Total Recall and Predator. Before that, but Commando stands out because it's not science fiction. It's not superhuman stuff. It's just, it is, but
or it's not. Let's say it's not meant to be science fiction,
right? And actually, when looking into this movie a little bit, I came across a genre that I didn't really think about until it was called high action. And I was just talking to my wife a few days ago about, because her background in literature about high fantasy, because things like Harry Potter is high fantasy. And she
got the dragon tattoos. I know all about high fantasy.
Yeah. So it's like where fantasy, what we consider fantasy as being like that's their world. It's not like low fantasy, which is like Matilda, where, one kid has like special powers, but everybody else is kind of normal. So high fantasy, that's where we are with this. And it's everything in the movie that if it happened in real life, we would be like, oh my god, like any one thing in the whole movie would just like blow people's minds. But it's seen as just like, oh, just another day for this guy.
It really is. So when I think of Commando, it's almost remarkable that Terminator came out first. Because Commando, well, first of all, it's such a worse movie objectively, even though I might greatly enjoy watching it, which I do. It's a bad movie, but it's bad in a campy sense. And for me, with respect to high action, as you called it, it's almost the origin of many of the cliches of that genre.
Yeah.
Or if it's not the origin of them, it's the earliest and perhaps most clear exemplar of them.
Yeah, it really does stand out. And so why don't we launch into the question and answer stuff? Because I'm sure we're going to have a lot to talk about with this movie. Sure. And what I want listeners to think about the whole time is that I learned that in 1986, they came out with a toy line for Commando, and it was like the packaging of it, the fact that they took John Matrix, Schwarzenegger's character, and put him back into his little crew. They called him the C Team in the toy series, which there's the A Team already, so now he's they skip over B Team, they go to C Team. And just like G.I. Joe, all of the characters look have a different specialization, and they have nicknames and specs, and the top of the box actually says for ages 5 and up,
right?
And this movie,
not the movie, the toy.
Right? The movie definitely isn't. But so like the idea of a kid who's like 5 or 6 years old getting this toy, having absolutely no hopefully he doesn't have any context for it, but
I swear, in looking at the cultural impact of this movie, it's like it almost seems like a CIA operation or something to like change our view of what they did in South America in the 70s and 80s.
like, oh no, it's this guy.
Oh, we were the good guys. Here's this action figure, and he's got big muscles and the Valverde scary South American place. Like,
I'm so glad that you brought that up, because I think that answers the first question. So the first question is what material is this made from? And on my other podcasts, I point out with movies, the actual film itself is the material, but we don't need to worry about that.
No. So what you mean is like, what are the symbolic materials of it?
Yeah,
Not
and
the concrete materials. Yeah, we know
yeah.
what movies are made of physically. What is this made of? It's made of American jingoism, right? It's made of the idea of like, well, actually, I mean, so thinking of just historiography and history, there's like the two competing perspectives in the last couple of hundred years. It's the great man theory of history and the trends and forces theory of history.
Mm-hmm.
And really, like, Arnold is the great man of history in this movie.
Yes.
It's like he's a singular force. And so it's made of that concept. I think it's made of which has a deep root. It's not just about American jingoism. The leading man has of course been very important in fiction for a very long time.
Mm-hmm.
Few have led as John Matrix though,
right.
And so the unique nature of Arnold's character in this movie. It comes from a uniquely American place. It's got huge muscles. It's very overt. It was dragged into this even though it didn't want to, because it's a strong good guy and only it can save the day, right? In a way, Arnold kind of is America in this sense. So yeah. So I know we chatted before. I mean, you brought up like the Vietnam War and its sequelae, the things that happened after it. For sure, this came from that as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, the whole era, I mean, so the Cold War is starting late 40s and dominating the foreign policy of the country for the next 50 years. Yeah, as of 1984, 85, they didn't know that it was going to come to an end, but the writing was on the wall.
Yes.
There was a remarkable transition from the 70s into the 80s with Reagan and bringing back the military during peacetime, and Vietnam inspired. I always get the feeling that throughout the early 80s, and most I think recognizable with the Vietnam War Memorial in Washington being dedicated in 1982, that there was this attempt to heal from that war for the society as well, and almost like an apology was being extended from the civilians to the veterans of that war for not receiving them the same way that the World War II generation had when they came home. And so as a way to kind of repair that reputation, we get this outpouring of that in our pop culture, from the A-Team, like I mentioned before, G.I. Joe, and then with Rambo in particular. Yeah, which the second Rambo movie came out earlier in 1985 from Commando, and that's another strongman movie.
First Blood,
and First Blood Part 2. And and then on the other side of the globe, you had the second Mad Max movie had come out a couple years before, which has another Cold War kind of end of the world future, possible future if the arms race went the wrong way. And so all of this is just like an outpouring into, in this case, a movie. The original. So the next question: how was it made? Like a lot of movies, it was written. I believe that First Blood is actually a book first, and then they made it into a movie.
I'm going to do a spoiler here. Commando was not a book.
Right. And that's where I was going with it, is that, it was completely contrived based on just the climate of the times. That
let's make one distinction here with Rambo and Commando and anything that came before it. One place these movies was made was the gym. Bodybuilding culture manifested in these movies in the enormous and superhumanly enormous biceps.
I'm glad you brought that up.
And of both Stallone and especially Schwarzenegger. I mean, Schwarzenegger was literally Mr. Olympia.
Yeah.
And he not only was Mr. Olympia, he was a different sort of Mr. Olympia at the time. He was enormous compared to other dudes. There was only a couple people that could compete with him, like Lou Ferrigno is another one.
Who gets tapped to be in, and then they take Lou Ferrigno and put him in the Incredible Hulk, because people like that just weren't part of the
No, this wasn't. In other words, this wasn't Charles Atlas or Charles Bronson or and what gave these men their power wasn't just their skills, although that's always emphasized in the movies. It was their enormous physical prowess, and that's a uniquely American thing too.
And I really think that informed, like you said, this movie was made for Schwarzenegger. They had to have it in mind. The original draft, I guess, the original idea dealt with an Israeli retired special forces guy who decides that he doesn't want to be living that life anymore. But then they said, well, here's Schwarzenegger. Let's rewrite it for him. And let's make this about him. So yeah, I think that absolutely the material, as I put on my list, it is bodybuilding and Arnold Schwarzenegger. That kind of physique just didn't, like you said, it was, even comic books didn't have those physiques and not till these guys start showing up on the big screen.
Yeah, and it's different. Even we look today and we say, oh, it's just like The Rock, or it's like, no, Mr. Olympia is not just like The Rock. The Rock's an enormous jack dude, and like nobody can achieve that naturally. And well, that's happening in the 2010s and 2020s. This is in the 80s.
Yeah.
This dude was enormous. I'm 6'2". He is 6'2", 245 with 18 abdominal muscles poking out from the t-shirt. You know what I'm saying? Like, this was a different sort of animal. And he was most famous not just as a bodybuilder, but for developing bodybuilding as a sport and science.
Yeah.
Like I have in the other room, I almost brought it to the podcast. Arnold's Encyclopedia of Modern Bodybuilding. Much of it now outdated, fair enough. But like, this dude was extremely formative in bodybuilding and then in high action for sure.
And I think that bodybuilding, well, they call it Muscle Beach, but that part in Southern California, that beach there where they are always,
Gym.
Gold's Gym came from there. It really says something about society's, leisure and recreation time, that if you are, whether it's through technology or just through having, extra income, whatever it is that allows for you to actually make money just from lifting weights, and being like a model, or, isn't in Pumping Iron, didn't Arnold and a few other guys get hired to pose at some art gallery as like living sculptures or something?
Oh, so now you're testing. I haven't watched Pumping Iron in a few years. If I remember, I think they did that. The movie starts out in part with him doing ballet as well.
Yeah.
And so, he was just he wasn't just a muscle guy, in other words. Stallone was just a muscle guy and actor, but Arnold wasn't. Arnold was at the peak of the muscle field and then came into acting on purpose, and it's just a different sort of transition.
It really is. And I'm glad you brought Stallone up. I'll skip ahead just to one of the other questions right now about why did they make it. And I pointed out before that First Blood Part 2, Stallone's, part of the second Rambo movie, which has very similar themes as far as,
although much more about Vietnam than this.
Right. Specifically Vietnam, where he actually goes back to Vietnam.
Yeah.
And then, so that came before Commando. And then by the end of the same year, 1985, Rocky IV, which is, if you're talking about jingoism and, Cold War themes, is the ultimate Cold War movie, where at the very, he takes on the Soviet Union himself, basically.
Right.
And, with Ivan Drago, the symbol of Soviet, athleticism and, with, robot likeness, he's basically the Terminator, and he fights him, almost to the death and all that stuff. So that movie,
those were good movies. Commando is fun to watch. Commando is not a good movie. So like, and I don't mean that in an insulting way. I mean, in terms of like the depth of the dialogue and the depth of the characters and things like this. Really, it's not even meant to be a good movie. It's meant to be your popping popcorn, sit around with your buddies and not think too much.
That's how you and I have always watched it, is just kind of like almost Mystery Science Theater 3000 style. Yeah, just like laughing at it and making, jokes, because how ridiculous it is.
So like, why did they make it? Let's see what it is really. So it's a movie where a guy is hiding in the mountains after years of being a special forces soldier and commander. And he's the best ever, apparently. He's hiding there with his daughter in this idyllic scene. And the movie starts with him showing his muscles, chopping down trees for his family. And within 15 minutes, his daughter is kidnapped. The soldiers that came to try and recruit him back in the military are dead. And Arnold is on a crusade against what we find out is a generic, hilariously cliche, not even authentic sounding South American dictator of a fictional country named Valverde, which I don't know, people won't be able to see, but you are apparently at Valverde right now, which it looks just
well, I have the image behind me. That's this shows on purpose.
Yes, you went to Valverde just for this podcast.
It was that important to me.
So what does that reveal? The fact that they did Valverde. Valverde is not a real place. Why wouldn't they just choose one of the dozens of countries? Well, most of those countries probably had a coup or something like it done by the CIA. So they didn't want to hit too close to home, but also Americans, and I don't want to come off as bashing America in this, but they're not famously worldly. So Valverde sounds just as real as, any other place to 1980s Americans. You know what I'm saying?
Well, that's what I put down for when what locations are associated with this.
Yeah.
Valverde in particular is it's a fictional, and it comes from one of the writers.
And if you
used it a couple of times,
if you ask the 1980s, if you ask the 1980s person point to Valverde on the map, they might point to Paraguay or Nicaragua,
right? Some
or
Central
Chile,
American and that's,
whatever.
And that was part of why it just, you don't even think about it when in the movie there's and you're just oh yeah, because these places
President
just kind of blend.
Is an Italian dude.
Yeah.
And people are like, fine, President Arias is the bad guy in the movie who's kidnapped the daughter, and he's trying to recruit Arnold to go on a crusade to get his country back for him, which apparently Arnold in the past had helped the new good guy president go in and take over from this bad guy, right? So it really quite literally is meant to be a cliche version of the America went in and took over, helped the right-wing group take over the left-wing group or whatever.
Yeah,
right? I mean, that's what happened dozens of times. So
banana republics.
It's remarkable. It's remarkable.
Yeah, it's pretty much you could just churn that story out pretty quickly. And when they did, and it's clear that so the reason why they made it was because they're like, well, here's a quick way to cash in on that's pretty much the extent, I would say, of the general audience, especially the target audience of this movie's interest and understanding of Western Hemisphere politics and military overthrows and stuff like that. And they're like, yeah, okay, makes sense. Let's do it. Yeah. So, when I ask the question of who makes it, you have a director by the name of Mark Lester. You have the star, Arnold Schwarzenegger. You have Silver Pictures, which is the production company within 20th Century Fox, and then 20th Century Fox, which is the distributor of this movie. And the role and status of them. Lester had been making movies like this, not exactly like this one, for a while. The previous year, he completed his work with Stephen King's Firestarter. Schwarzenegger, like we said before, had just come off the Terminator, which in that movie he really has no dialogue at all. He just has a few lines, and
by the way, a much better, like we said, a much better movie, a much higher budget movie, and now a much more long-term culturally impactful movie. And you might say, why would he go backwards and do this? It's like, well, there weren't an enormity of roles for 260-pound bodybuilder Austrian guys who couldn't speak English that well.
Well, and at least in this time period, they explained his accent a bit more, because John Matrix is from East Germany, and they even in Kindergarten Cop he talks about he's from Austria, and all that stuff. By the time you get to Jingle All the Way, they're just done with that. They don't ever explain why this guy who lives in Minneapolis, and has a family that has normal, regular American accents is just, speaking like that, and they're like, whatever, just
They
forget
explained
about
it in this movie in the first 10 minutes.
Right. He's like,
Why don't they just call him Girl George? Remember? And she goes, "Oh, Dad, that's so old." Alyssa Milano's says that to him, and he says, "Well, when I was a boy growing up in Spreckensploit, East Germany, the communists said it was subversive. Maybe they were right." So we know instantly he's from East Germany, the good guy side.
Well, no, that's the bad
guy side. The bad guy side. Yeah,
he defected,
but he escaped it to the good guy side, and now he's on the good team. Yeah.
Right, and they must have vetted him pretty quickly. They're like, you can be some special forces guys, Delta Force. You're probably solid.
Yes.
And then so he's the Terminator, and then you have 20th Century Fox, pretty old studio, Silver Pictures that started in the 1980. I guess where I'm going with this, as far as what it tells us about the time period, is that the movie industry was surging back to prominence in the 80s, and it was riding on the big blockbuster action movies. That's really what brought it back, because television was going that direction too. I mentioned the A-Team before. I mean, that show was on. It was highly violent. They had all sorts of crazy, very similar ideas behind it too. These special forces guys who are retired, but then they act as mercenaries and all this stuff. But they couldn't push the boundaries too far, because the 80s were such a strange time when it came to this idea of like, we want to be a place where people can make lots of money really quickly, but at the same time we want to be the moral leader of the world. We want to have, so that's hard to do if you're going to have limitations on TV as far as what you can show and what you can hear. But movies, they can offer all of it, right? As long as they stay under the cap of whatever rating they're looking for. And this movie was rated R for obvious reasons. And, I think that actually brought some appeal to the movie too, for its intended audience was, it's not rated PG or PG-13. This is R. So get ready for some serious, violence and sex and language and everything.
And it goes without saying, this was obviously pre-internet, pre-Netflix, pre-all of this. So there was two ways you watched a movie, really. It was you went to the movie theaters, or you timed your day around when it was played on the TV, or you taped it and watched it later. TV wasn't just the box. It was the system by which you received the content through the box.
Right.
And
it was and they were competing quite a bit with video game systems being hooked up to TVs, VCRs, like you mentioned, the movie rental stores. I can vividly remember throughout the 80s seeing big posters in the video rental stores of movies like Commando and Predator, and seeing Arnold Schwarzenegger right there, which made it so later on when he was in a movie like Kindergarten Cop, which I was allowed to see, it made it almost all that more. And they played off of that in the first part of that movie, where in the first part of Kindergarten Cop, he's basically acting like John Matrix, or he's acting like the Terminator,
or any of his cliche characters. He almost acts like the Terminator.
And then he did Twins around that time, and he was, and those movies, like, part of the punchline of those was that this is Arnold Schwarzenegger. This is the guy that single-handedly destroys an entire island nation. Now in a way that The Rock and modern guys, they don't hit that note. They're just almost looked at as normal in movies. Like, oh, it's just a big guy. And it's maybe commented on, but you're right. The punchline of Kindergarten Cop or Last Action Hero, or even more so Jingle All the Way, the punchline of these movies is often like, what the hell is this Mr. Olympia doing as a kindergarten teacher? Like, cops don't look like this guy. Right. Like, it's just not, it's crazy. I think that he struck a unique chord in American culture because of how excellent he was in his previous life. And he was almost granted, like, people just wanted to see Arnold. Yeah.
And it wasn't necessarily that he was like the sexiest man alive. It was more so that, like, men idealized his physique rather than women desiring it. Of course, women like muscles in movies and so forth, and that was a selling point. But really, it was about the kind of like masculine archetype made manifest in this weird foreign dude who came here because he likes it here, and we're the best, and watch him pretend to kick an ass in the name of America for 2 hours for $12. Like that was his selling point.
Yeah. And that's such a good way of putting it. I mean, he held that so perfectly throughout the 1980s, and that was his era for certain. Was and that was his wheelhouse, was that. And I think he lost it later on. He tried to return to it after he made, like, Terminator 2 is his return to that kind of movie again. But then by the end of the 90s, when he keeps making like he makes the movie Eraser. And I remember seeing that in the theater, and I went to see it because it was Schwarzenegger. I'm like, it's Arnold. I love him. I think he's great. Yeah. And while watching that, I'm like, it just didn't really match the time period as well, because it takes
Arnold, because Arnold is a lump hammer, not a nail gun. He comes in and knocks it off the walls. And in Eraser, he was like a secret agent.
Right.
I have only seen Eraser once or twice, and the reason is because it didn't really feel as much like an Arnold movie as other Arnold movies.
Well, and I think you and I went and saw Terminator 3 together, and by that point, it was getting, because he'd been governor of an entire state by that point, and
another remarkable.
And so it was weird seeing him come in, and it was just like it just didn't work anymore because. Yeah. CGI effects had gotten to the point where they could take anybody and make them lethal. Yeah. And then he shows up and he's still wearing a leather jacket, looking like a biker dude from the original movie, and then the second movie. And it's just, it doesn't really work the same way. So,
and it still wasn't his worst effort. And it was like, he did what he could with it. But like and to be fair to Terminator 3, they had a nice sort of, plot line for explaining why he was an old bastard now instead of instead of the young wolf that he was in the earlier movies, But like even if they explained it away, it just didn't feel it didn't draw us in as much,
Not at all. It was weird in that way. It was kind of, I hate to say it, but it was sad, because this one had been held up on such a high pedestal, that to see him trying to repeat that look and everything was just, I think maybe you should turn to other things, which he eventually did.
And a lot of, even Terminator 2 onward, but especially Terminator 3 and many of the later movies he did. In contrast to Commando, and actually a Jeopardy champion, Ken Jennings, wrote a book about this, where a lot of modern movies use humor an enormous amount to kind of mask over or make more palatable the epic violence or lust or whatever they're portraying on the screen. Commando actually isn't meant anyway to be a funny movie.
No. It's meant to be taken pretty seriously.
It's taken seriously. Maybe it's like winking at the camera because he like gets hit by a car, jumps up and starts running right away. But like that character ain't winking. It's kind of the movie winking at you. Whereas like in modern there's much more violence, say, in even a modern Marvel movie where entire cities are destroyed. Mm-hmm. But because the jokes are coming at you faster than a New York City comedy club, it doesn't feel that scary. Even the characters in the violent scenes are cracking jokes to each other. The Hulk and Iron Man and this. Arnold wasn't joking. He's like, give me back my daughter. I'm pretty mad about you taking her, and I'm going to kill everybody, and you ain't going to hear a punchline from me.
No, he doesn't do that at all. And I think those modern Marvel movies are definitely just another reflection of the time period in which they were made, because we've become such a commentary-prone society with our entertainment that we want we're always talking, the movie-going experience has changed so much. Even if you go to the movies, it's people are making memes and GIFs or whatever. They're doing all these side commentary, and so it's almost like with the modern movies, they're just putting us in the actual movie itself. They're like, oh yeah, we know that this is funny. It's that self-effacing humor that they have, that's why it's so nice in watching Commando, because they don't do that.
No,
they allow us to make those jokes.
And in fact, if you go back and watch Terminator 2, compared to Terminator 1. Really, there's a huge disparity there.
Yeah.
John Connor in Terminator 2 is like, making the big guy say funny things.
Yeah.
And even though it wasn't as much as modern Marvel movies and so forth in terms of the jokes, they were coming at you way faster than in Terminator 1, which is
when they kick into Bad to the Bone.
Dark movie. That's a dark movie, Terminator 1.
Yeah. Oh, very much. It's very noir. And
Terminator 2 is kind of hokey. There's not as many kill shots. It's like, but Terminator 1 is just a brutal kind of snuff film with a killer robot. And Terminator 2 is like a hero robot saves the day from bad robot with kid helper. Like
it's like what is it? 1.5 Cops, with Burt Reynolds and so this movie Commando, I found it interesting, its release date. Considering I think I mentioned to you before that I found the director's cut, which is 2 minutes longer than the original one, which tells me it probably was thrown together pretty quickly. So they filmed it over the course of a month and a half, starting in the spring of 1985. They probably could have had it out by the end of the summertime, but it came out in October, which is, of course, in the movie industry, that's when a lot of the slasher movies and the horror movies come out. And yet it dominated in the theater in October. So it wasn't like, I know that sometimes movie companies will intentionally release movies like this, or ones they don't expect a lot of people to go see on their own, simultaneously with whatever is the big movie of that time of the year, because they know that either tickets will get sold out, and the people are, well, I'm already at the theater, so I'll go see this instead. Or they might get to the theater and they're like, maybe I don't want to see that. I'd rather go see, look at Arnold. He looks cool. I'll go see that. But this movie like dominated that entire month, which is funny because, again, most people in October, they're gearing up for Halloween. They want to go see something scary. And this isn't scary. It's an action movie. It's, thriller, maybe, suspenseful in some parts, but it's definitely not anything close to the horror genre. And I think that's just interesting that maybe they timed it that way on purpose, because they're like, well, that summertime crowd, they all went and saw Back to the Future, that we wouldn't have been able to compete with that anyway, because that is a much more, it's a PG movie. It has this was going to be for like college guys and older teenagers and young men. They're the main audience, and so maybe they don't have a date to bring to a scary movie to comfort throughout it, and they'll just go see Arnold destroying Valverde on their own. So I think that's really all I can take away from that. So the next question is, where was it made? And again, with the low budget component of it, they made it all in Southern California. They didn't really go anywhere to make this movie. And we talked a little bit about Valverde before, and I think that we were both right on the same line with that. They just make up this place, and I guess the writer has put it into some of his other movies. They even think that Predator, people theorize, including himself, that Predator takes place in Valverde too. That it's just like, because they didn't want to agitate, and that tells you something about the climate of, and also the audience, that these movies were reaching beyond American screens. And so if you screen a movie like this and you call it Colombia or you call it Nicaragua, that might turn off some audiences even before the movie comes out, that they're like, how are they depicting our country?
This is why I'm only half joking when I say I wonder if this was a CIA psyop or something. Or I don't want you to say psyop because I sound like a conspiracy guy, but like the CIA and other American arms of the government, like they have had a hand in Hollywood historically. And for me, as much as I like these movies, you can't help but read into it in that regard. It's like, this is meant to maybe we'll say pave the way or whitewash what America was doing in the world geopolitically, such that anybody not paying too much attention who had something like this in their head would be prone to interpreting geopolitical events in a manner more favorable to the United States. It's unlikely, in other words, that a Commando could have been made in 1985 that where Arnold was kind of like going against the United States forces and stopping a coup or something.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know that that movie could have been made or would have been received well because of the other pervasive propaganda around what was going on in South America. I mean, Val Verde doesn't even make sense in the Spanish language. I speak a little bit of Spanish. I'm not like fluent or anything. I had to look up what Val meant. I thought maybe I didn't know.
Yeah.
It means like okay. So Verde means green. This means okay, green. They probably thought it meant, without even checking, they probably thought it meant Green Valley, Val
Right.
Verde. It doesn't mean Green Valley, as far as I can understand. As far as I can find. So it's one of those where it's like low effort. It's like,
I'm sure they spent all about
better?
30 seconds thinking that one up, and they're like, yeah, that's fine. Just let's keep with that one.
Or they could have found a guy who might, speak Spanish as a second language for the dictator of the Spanish country, instead of President Arias. I forget what the actor's name was. It's like this dude, he looked like he's a used car salesman in Toledo,
Right.
like he didn't look like he was the dictator of a South American country. Yeah.
And there's so many movies like this in the time period. I can't nail down the exact dates, but I think about like the Iron Eagle movies where they just generic Middle Eastern strongman, dictator guy that's holding the dad hostage and stuff like that. And where they just...
We went through time periods, right? So we had the Vietnam and its responses. We had the South American coups and their responses. We had the Cold War and movies that responded to that. And we had the Korean War and movies that responded to that, and so on and so forth. And now, if you look at, it's still true. If you look at modern movies, who are the bad guys? It's still typically Russians, right? They're like the easy ones.
Well, when they made that,
you get white guys to do a Russian accent, I think.
When they did Creed 2 a couple years ago, where it's Apollo Creed's son.
Yeah.
Is fighting against Ivan Drago's son.
Yeah.
It's like, well, I wonder why they recreated this rivalry. Oh, that one, that hasn't been ended yet. It's still Russia. Yeah, it's all over the place.
Russia
So one of my problems, I don't know if it's a problem or not, but I remember this dates all the way back. I can remember in high school where when I was in art class, we had to do a still life, and I got huge praise from my teacher because I had used the entire frame. Like I covered the entire canvas, and I she's like, look at how he brings in the viewer into this still life, like this bowl of food or whatever it was. And I got so carried away with it. Like the next time we did one, I focused in within like an inch. And it was just like the shadows, and like you couldn't even tell what it was. It was just abstract. So I'm like, oh, look how deep I got. And she was like, I think you went too far. So I don't know if I'm reading into this too much, but when I was looking at the places where they filmed this, which I think was about 3 square miles of Southern California, one of the places, so the barracks that he basically has that big shoot 'em up with all the foot soldiers, was at the Harold Lloyd Estate, and then one of the other filming locations, like the Presidential Palace, was part of the William Randolph Hearst Castle Estates. And I was like, maybe, I don't know, there might be something to this. I find it coincidental, if nothing else, that Hearst and his newspaper, the New York Tribune, back in 1898 was pretty integral in getting the United States involved in the Spanish-American War, which eventually begins our relationship with Central and South America. Shortly after.
Jingoism. Yeah.
Exactly. And you get into the early 20th century with Roosevelt and his corollary, which basically said, it's an extension of the Monroe Doctrine. We're able to, we can basically giving ourselves permission to be the policeman of Central and South America. And so I'm like, I don't know if that was intentional. They're like, of all the places that we can go, quite literally shoot, we're going to go to the Hearst, somebody that was so part of it. And then the other part of it with Harold Lloyd, Harold Lloyd was a 1920s silent film comedic actor, and this movie couldn't be any more opposite of those kinds of films. And so by having another, firefight scene, I might be going too far with it, but I always think that when somebody, even if they're not realizing it, I think in this case, a filmmaker, when they're making their movie, subconsciously, they're like informed.
There are no random thoughts.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. We've talked about that before. There's no real, coincidences, like something compelled that. And maybe I'm the one who cracked the code on that. Or maybe, like you said, there was a, CIA person in the ear and be like, maybe we should go over to that Hearst.
And you know what? To your point, like I don't want to sound like a conspiracy guy. I have no evidence that this movie was generated by anything having to do with the CIA, but propaganda works in a number of different ways, right? I made somewhat of, as a psychologist, I've made somewhat study of propaganda over the years, just as a personal interest, both American propaganda and propaganda abroad. And propaganda works in primarily actually in kind of shaping the sorts of thoughts that seem reasonable to you. Mm-hmm. And it does, so ad campaigns, things that are in movies and so forth, they make available certain ways of framing the world, and they make less available other ways of framing the world. And so that's why you get a very homogeneous population if they're very insular in their propaganda, if they're not receiving worldwide news and things like this. Certain things become the American way of seeing things. And, that of course isn't, or any way of seeing things, and the North Korean way of seeing things, of course. So a movie like this kind of strikes me more in that sense, where this kind of was one of those movies that set the stage for thinking about the American police style hero who goes around saving the day, whether he's supposed to or not. Because in this movie, it's not like he was being recruited by the US military to do this, save his daughter. He was being recruited to do other stuff. And then he said, screw you. And he went and saved his daughter. You know what I mean?
Right.
Because he's the tough guy, and that's what an American tough guy does. He doesn't put up with any bullshit from the government or any crazy South American dude either. Give me my daughter back.
Right. And there's a lot of single-mindedness with this, where it's just at every single state, every problem that comes his way, he takes charge of the situation and he just handles it. He just figures out exactly what to do at the exact right moment, and uses his muscle, basically both his brain and so I think you're absolutely right about that. There's, again, even if it wasn't part of the production where they're like, we need to get this point across, it's just another one of those symbols of the time period, that mid 1980s, that was just, and just so much groundwork being laid as far as trying to repair perhaps the way things had turned throughout the 1970s, that there, in some ways, the 80s were a period of cultural reconstruction for the country. And you can see that.
And in a sense, I mean, it was an Orwell book, I think, called All Art is Propaganda. And so in a sense, I mean, whether it means to be or not, art reflects from where it comes and to whom it's directed. And in that sense, it's not really even a criticism of the movie. It's not like, oh, this movie sucks because it's just American jingoist propaganda. It's, well, even if it is in a piece of American jingoistic propaganda, it probably wasn't only or mostly made for that purpose. It just is that, because art, when considered in its context, does have a propagandistic element. And I think always, unless you're in, art reflects the culture from which it comes, which reflects our biology and so forth, all the way down,
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And as you mentioned before, this movie would not have been made 10 years earlier. Maybe would have
10
been
years later.
10 years later.
10 years later, there would have been a million jokes.
It would have been True Lies. It would have been him actually winking at the camera and being like, isn't it ridiculous that I'm doing these things? And or Last Action Hero, which was basically him lampooning his own movies. And that's where we had gotten by the 90s for certain. Now going back up to the question of, and we've covered a lot of this already, so we don't have to like, rehash everything, but who is the intended audience? If we're treating this as an artifact of the 1980s, when they were making it, who did they have in mind?
I mean, the easy answer to that is the young to middle-aged American male.
Yeah.
Or maybe I shouldn't even give it an age period, because I don't know that that's a fact. I would say this is obviously a quote unquote guy movie, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where there aren't too many redeeming qualities about John Matrix in this movie, except his love for his daughter, that women would find endearing. He's not even particularly nice. He's not even particularly nice to his newly discovered paramour in the movie. Like,
we haven't even mentioned her yet. Yeah.
Yeah. He's kind of like, let me drive me around and fly me there and like leave me alone. And then at the end, I think he kisses her and then goes off into the sunset.
Yeah, because he just kind of runs into her. She's not part of the.
She's in a mall. A mall.
And that's another thing too. I should mention
that
same mall was used again in Terminator 2. And it's the Galleria. It's the, when the girls are asking, when telling the T-1000 where they went. It's the nice. Galleria.
And in Commando, Arnold does a fireman's carry on a whole phone booth containing a person. And then he swings on a balloon and lands on top of an elevator and then punches the elevator, takes the dude out of it. I remember there's a scene where 8 cops surround him and he just goes, and they all fly off him.
It's and just that setting alone puts it in the time period too, because he's in malls a lot, and there's
no like real martial arts moves. There's not like
he's in malls, so there's this one. He's in a mall at the beginning of Kindergarten Cop, which is definitely trying to tap into this movie and saying like, well, we've seen this before with this guy in a mall.
Arnold's in a mall again, run.
Yeah, right. Look out. And then even in Jingle All the Way, he shows up to the Mall of America, and that's where he's running down the bouncy ball thing. And again, that's saying of the time period, because like if you film the movie in a mall now, it would be just Dawn of the Dead. Because malls are not, nobody goes to malls anymore.
Malls are dead.
And and when that movie came out in the 70s, and then the remake in the it was all about commentary on consumerism and materialism, that we're all zombies and stuff like that. And the reason why it's such a prominent component of the movie in the 80s is because everyone knew the mall, right? You were always going to the mall.
Where did we hang out? Where did we try and meet girls? Where were the movie theaters located?
In the mall.
Where could you grab a quick bite? And America's weird compared to like, say, European countries, because we don't really walk places. A mall is actually a place where you can go and like walk from store to store. Only in inner cities can you generally do that. And for those of us who didn't grow up in a big metropolis, the mall was that kind of city within the suburb.
Yeah. They were like prefab shopping districts. Whatever. Yeah, because and those are a direct product of the growth of the suburbs, because there were these manufactured towns that didn't have a naturally existing commercial center, and so they're like, well, we have to make one, and so that's you get a mall. And being in Southern California and LA area, it's a different kind of mall than I think most people are familiar with. But even LA is like the ultimate suburb, because it's just this sprawling urban area that has, and it was formed so quickly in the early 20th century, and just took shape so rapidly that they had no choice. There's no naturally occurring. Right. Yeah. It's not despite what that song Walking in LA talks about, it is really not, it's not a walking city. It's not Manhattan. And so it's so funny, because like, from just that scene alone, we're like, that's the 80s for you. They I think they overdid it if you've watched any of the Stranger Things seasons. I really liked the first series of Stranger Things, because it just plopped it right into 1984, and I was like, yep, it looks like 84, sounds like 84, everything. It was subtle. And then increasingly, as they got on with the seasons, by the time they got to the third one, it was just, how can we scream mid 1980s louder in your ear? Let's show a mall in all of its glory. And I'm like, I especially in like middle of Indiana, I can't imagine a mall being that crazy busy all the time. Like I went to malls a lot as a kid and I never saw anything like that. But it was trying too hard, I think, to be 80s. But this movie had no choice of being an 80s movie. It was. And so one of the many places is the mall. You're going to find somebody, and all this hijinks goes on. And I'll remind you at this point once again that yes, they made kids toys out of this movie.
I was just going to say, this is where you can go buy the Commando action figure.
Yeah, in the background you might see it, which you might confuse with a GI Joe action figure because the box looked identical to the GI Joe stuff. Right. So,
and that's that's kind of we're talking about interpreting the cultural significance of this movie and interpreting it as a primary source. And so, I mean, if we do the toys in that sense, what does that say? It says like the fact that they're a knockoff A-Team kind of GI Joe kind of thing, they called the C-Team, you said?
Yeah.
I mean, man, like what was I forget, maybe it was like Gorbachev when he came over and he said, when he went into a supermarket, he said, we lost the Cold War.
Yeah.
He saw how many varieties of the same stuff was like we got 18 mayonnaises. He's like, I can't compete with 18 mayonnaises. And it's often like levied at America as a criticism, even if it's just a fact of America. It's like we have 20 different military action figures for our 5-year-olds. And this one's $2 cheaper, so you can afford it too,
And those were not even, I mean, those are also a product. There's a great series on Netflix called The Toys That Made Us. And they do a one about G.I. Joe, and they point out very well in that by the end of the 70s, G.I. Joe had, first of all, gone off of being military guy. They made him a scuba diver and an astronaut because of Vietnam. Parents weren't buying their kids military toys anymore. And
too many caskets to want the kid to be a soldier.
Right. And then when they come back into the 80s, it corresponds perfectly with Reagan becoming president and then, being very explicit, I'm going to rebuild the military, that the toys became, so this is just one part of that. This movie, it definitely wasn't made because of G.I. Joe, but the same thing that allowed for G.I. Joe to just return with such a huge popularity behind it definitely propelled movies like this to show up on the big screen, because an audience that this movie was made for was too old to be watching cartoons. They weren't going to be watching G.I. Joe on Saturday mornings. They were interested in their age group's version of G.I. Joe, and they got it. This is John Matrix is as bad
exactly what this is.
And so is everywhere.
I think that the fact that you have action figures for movies that you have kids, I have kids. A lot of kids' toys do better or worse in the market because of how appealing they are to the adults who buy them for the kids.
Oh yeah, the packaging nowadays has gone right back to where it was.
Oh, an Arnold! I'll give my kid the Arnold, and like, and that's, because kids weren't seeing this movie and then asking their parents for it, right?
Right.
A lot of it, look, it has to be said, there are two types of wars that the United States has entered into, or conflicts. Let's not call them wars, right? World War I and especially World War II were the so-called good wars, where it's very difficult from an objective sense to find out why we were wrong to answer these, unless you're some kind of Pat Buchanan isolationist apologist. Like it's difficult to say why we shouldn't have went into World War II. Like there were obvious good sides, bad sides, even if we had to team up with Stalin and all that, right? The American zeitgeist about those movies was we were the good guys. Americans, that momentum carried into Korea and Vietnam and so forth. But after Vietnam, it was hard, based on the facts on the ground, and despite all the propaganda, for Americans to think we're the unquestionable good guys about this, which is where you get what you were saying earlier, the soldiers coming home and being treated poorly, and the huge amounts of protests, and like not for good reason. For good reason in a lot of sense. What like Nixon and Kissinger did to extend the war for political reasons and so forth. All that was starting to come out to the more intellectual members of our society, and that sentiment trickles down to those who don't know the facts but get the sentiment.
Yeah, and on the nightly news too.
What's
nightly
that?
news on the nightly news. You're seeing images from Vietnam
Even there, eventually.
that
Yeah.
you wouldn't
What
have
was it?
in
Was it
previous wars.
Cronkite? Was it Cronkite who eventually said his piece? I forget. I might have the wrong news guy
No, you
about
do. He was on location and basically saying it's
right.
over. There's when you see it too much, when it becomes part of and I think that's what changed people's minds about Vietnam compared to is basically the media ability to cover it. If they had that ability back in 1945, they would have. And I think we've got a lot different take on World War II. And actually, coincidentally, 2 episodes ago on my podcast, I reviewed the movie Northwest Passage, which came out in 1940 and is about commandos of the 1750s. And that movie was definitely a propaganda piece, I conclude, because it was showing previous times when the United States had teamed up with Great Britain, in its
Was it against the Ottomans?
Well, yeah, in that it was so it's a French and Indian War story. It's about here in North America, and so the Rogers Rangers
all right.
are the commandos, and they go on a raid of an Indian settlement in Quebec, and the whole movie is about that. But throughout the film, you get lots of imagery of Anglo-American cooperation, because that actually is historically accurate. He was fighting for the king in America, and so at the press of at that time, 1940, during the Battle of Britain, when the American society was being asked to consider whether or not they would get behind another conflict within so many years on the side of Great Britain. I think that movie fits in perfectly as pro-war, pro-American entry into World War II propaganda. Yeah. And I just find it coincidental that it's another Commando movie, whereas this one's not asking anybody to join even the military, because he's one of the most elite Delta Force guys. He's not like an enlisted dude, that could, I think this movie has more along the line of like, you didn't know these kinds of guys exist, but they do. You look at how, even this East German born guy, he's going to come, like you said before, and fight on the good side. He's going to, he's the one that knows what's up. And, this is what the real thing is not all that different from what you're watching on, these guys
it's kind of Hulk Hogan.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, you set up the antithesis cliches like, the Iron Sheik and Nikolai Volkov. And then you have Hulkster, who like comes out with the American flag and he's pointing at them and like, like, this isn't going to go well for you, bad guys. And even if I lose this battle, you'll see at WrestleMania, I'll win the war. And at the beginning, John Matrix loses, his first couple of fights with these guys. He gets shot with a tranquilizer and shipped off to talk to the general and so forth. And in the end, at WrestleMania, John Matrix wins. You know what I mean? Yeah. He shows up, he's got the camo on, and he's like, let's do this. And because you're an hour and 15 minutes in, this one's going to go different.
It's wrapping up. And it's and I believe that's all semi-autobiographical on Schwarzenegger's part, because that's how he came to America, right? He was tranquilized, and then
yes.
Yeah,
I wrote that though. Evil that brought him to America.
I wrote that
it had testosterone cypionate in it, not tranquilizers.
Yes. I put that as one of my what does this tell you about those? I because the movie was reshaped, the script was reshaped to fit Schwarzenegger. I can't help but think that some of it parallels his own life and career, that he came to the United States, he got a degree in business from the University of Wisconsin, and that he eventually...
Nobody's perfect.
Yeah. And then he ends up going, beyond this movie into being the head of the Presidential's Council on Physical Fitness. And
I was talking with Wifey earlier. What do we got? We got the best bodybuilder ever, the highest paid actor ever, and the former governor of California who married a Kennedy.
One of the biggest economies of the world. He was the head of that he got
and he married a Kennedy.
All the way, all of that stuff. So he is the American dream, and yet he's from Austria, and I think so. In some ways, it's almost this movie is like a fast forward version of that. It's just kind of like
and Arnold came here with like $20 in his pocket or whatever the cliche story is. True in his case, so it's not even a cliche.
Yeah.
He's in many ways, ignoring genetics and the randomness of circumstance, he is the self-made man as much as one can be. He was escaping the fascism of his father. Coming from Austria. I mean, there are a few other important figures from history that came from Austria around the same time of his father. Yep. And he was escaping their political leanings as well. Even though he's a right-wing guy, he's kind of like a classical liberal in his politics, much more than he is a strongman right-winger. So in a sense, Arnold, not just because of his physique, but kind of his mental physique, like how he had worked on himself and where he came from, his origin story, it made him the perfect version of this character, despite his accent. And it really is remarkable because it's not like the 80s were a hospitable time for foreigners in the United States compared to, say, today. Like, so you have this giant Austrian dude on TV claiming to be an American. You can imagine a parallel universe where this is received quite poorly by the American man. And yet it wasn't. It was super embraced despite the accent. And I think a big reason for that is that whether it was overt or covertly, Arnold's love for the country came out in these and in his talks. And it was just clear he was like trying to be as American as possible. People like that about him,
Yeah. And in his personal life as well. I think that a lot of people were throughout that era and beyond has kind of propped him up as like the ideal foreign-born person, immigrant, to come to the country and what we would want in somebody.
And defeat Governor Gray Davis.
Yeah.
Imagine you run for governor of California and you win by leaning on your movie slogans, by just basically repeating over and over, we need to do a total recall of Governor Gray Davis.
Your governorship
we like that. He said a lot of that stuff.
Yeah, and it was taken seriously, and people had the similar reactions to that as they did when Hulk Hogan returned from being in NWO, right, the New World Order, and he was bad for a little while, and then when he came back as regular Hulk Hogan, people lost their minds. They're like, yes, because it's simple. And
this is an important distinction. I was talking earlier this morning about Hulk Hogan, trying to get ready for this podcast, because I think these are similar characters. And I think the big difference is that the Hulkster kind of marked out on his own gimmick. He thought he was Hulk Hogan at the end, and it kind of like destroyed him as a person. And Arnold didn't think he was John Matrix, and it's what allowed him to progress as a person. He was the best bodybuilder in the world, but he's like, I want to do better. I want to do more. So he goes and he becomes the biggest actor in Hollywood, and he says, this is just silly poppycock. I need to go and be in the governor's mansion. And so he did that too. And he didn't do it. It's not like he was my favorite politician or something, especially once he was all said and done. It's not like he did very much or was a good governor per se, at least objectively. You might think he is or isn't, but like he still did that. And that's remarkable.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It really is a remarkable life story. And in a sense, like his life, he's the type of dude where his life story is more remarkable than even the silly characters he plays in his movies.
Yeah. Well, one day they make a biopic about him. They could really center on any one part of his life or another, and it'd be a fantastic movie.
And they could hire his Mexican son to play him. If you've seen his jacked son of the affair he had with his I think his housekeeper or something. Like now he's like doing muscular poses on Instagram. He looks just like Arnold. He's clearly he's saucier than Long Island spaghetti. You know what I mean?
Of all the places that have a statue of Arnold Schwarzenegger, Columbus, Ohio has one. I was there this summer, and first of all, I didn't realize how huge Columbus, Ohio is.
Yeah, it's big. I've been there a few times. Yeah.
And outside their convention center, they have this big bronze statue of Arnold Schwarzenegger. And
Next time I go there, I'll take a picture in front of it and send it to you. And it
Yeah.
could be the thumbnail for this podcast going
it
forward.
would be. Well, I guess we have to wait a little while, but he had something, I forget what the placard that went along with it said, but something that he is part of the reason why Columbus is on the map for its, the Mr. Universe competition or something like that. But I just found it very strange because you would think Schwarzenegger's statue would be in Thule, Austria, where he's from, and I think there might be one there, or a stadium named after him or something like that, or obviously like in Sacramento, California, where he was governor, or somewhere in LA. But to have it in Columbus, Ohio, just shows how wide-reaching his aura, for lack of a better term, his legacy extends, and he's still alive. He's still adding to that. So I think and throughout this podcast, we've definitely covered the ideas and behavior that this movie conveys, very well. And so the last question is this prescriptive or descriptive? And since it's fiction and it's high action, it's entirely prescriptive. And again, we've talked about that a lot, indirectly throughout this. I hope it's not descriptive, because like I said at the beginning, if any of these things actually ever happened, it would be, just any one scene from that movie would be something that would just turn the internet news feed on its, out of its mind.
Well, in a literal sense, it can't be descriptive. I agree that it's a prescriptive thing. I wonder if high action and high fantasy really fits this dichotomy very well, right? It could just be symbolic.
Yeah.
But in that sense, I guess it's prescriptive, right? Because what they're saying is this is the way things should be done. Somebody takes your daughter and you're capable like Arnold. You better hold on to that airplane, fall into the swamp, go get her back, and at the end, if you need to, launch a 600-pound metal tube through your opponent's chest, and say a catchphrase afterwards, and then carry your daughter, who presumably has like the worst PTSD of all time, out to the airplane. Like, if you ain't doing that, you're not being as manly as you could be. And really, so for me, there's this Jungian idea in psychology of archetypes and so forth. I don't know how much credence I give it, but if we're just extending it to movies and movie interpretation, Arnold really is, in that sense, the epitome of the think first man, the non-intellectual. And as an intellectual, I don't take it as an insult, but like just that thinking, there would be the guys who thought too much about this, and then there's the man of action, the leading man. We used that phrase earlier, who's just he's gonna go get it done. He's like that kind of the epitome of the self-directed man who knows what's right and he doesn't need your help. Thank you very much.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think it sets, again, in its own way, because it is so highly prescriptive in that sense of what it's trying to get you to think about or feel while you're watching it. I've done that before too. When I'm watching a movie, I'm like, what would I do in a situation like this? Would I, I wouldn't even know where to start with that. Imagine me dating.
In Commando, it's tough.
Right. It's hard to match that, but
you probably just fall down the hill at the beginning, shot dead.
And I can't even imagine why any of that would happen to me, because, I've never been a special ops guy, but then on the other hand, again, because it's so highly prescriptive, it's in its own way descriptive of the era, that those kinds of movies were made without any kind of, they, like we said throughout this, they're not looking back at the camera being like, oh, this is corny. We all know it's corny. It's the viewers watching it. And like every time I've watched it, I just turn my brain off for a little while. I just enjoy it for how fun it is. And because when you think about it, you're like, the ending scene where he's, the climax of the movie where he's, these guys just running out of the barracks shooting, and he's just like, he's ending countless human lives, and he just walks away. That's, if you think of, I'm like, every single one of those people, and I've gotten to a point where I don't really like to watch, as time has gone on, when violent movies and action movies have become that much more like explicit, and I get very bothered. I don't find any enjoyment in it because I'm like, I understand it's like every human is a set of memories and they have friends and there's somebody's kid. You don't think about that in this movie because it's just so wild. It's so out there and extreme that, you can still watch it, even after I kind of came to that arrival in my own head. I can still watch Commando, be like, aha, look at him go.
Yes.
And
I have to say, it was my favorite homework I've done in a long time was watching Commando this morning, getting ready. I think like, and it goes back to something I said earlier. I think a reason that a lot of the modern movies fail to elicit, or I wouldn't even say they fail. They make a ton of money. So if that's your criteria, so be it. But the reason you won't see movies like this anymore is how much humor they pair with the increasing levels of violence.
Yeah.
It's like, if you're destroying a city and cracking jokes at the same time, for me, that's more off-putting than like Arnold getting his daughter back, even if he's saying one-liners. I also think like they don't make R-rated movies anymore, even if there's more violence in them. They don't make them because they don't make money. Right. Because people don't go see them because they bring kids to movie theaters, and they Netflix and chill with their adults. So, in that sense, that the movie couldn't even really be made these days because they don't make R-rated movies. If they made this movie today, he would be cracking jokes the whole time about these people, and
it'd be unwatchable because
it'd be a little more unwatchable, and also because it has to be said in this, it makes you sound like a Luddite or a curmudgeon, but I think that when you have amazing CGI and special effects that look hyper realistic, even more realistic than the real world, if that makes sense, to kind of super stimuli, like you might have in when the robots are coming through a portal in the sky in a Marvel movie or something, like that stuff. It's not campy at all, and camp gets us through some of the filth. So if you remember Lord of the Rings, I don't know if you read Lord of the Rings.
No.
But there's a character in there that's not in the movies. And it was a common trope that was in Tolkien's first book. Before Frodo et al. Go on their adventure, there's Tom Bombadil, who they meet in a forest and who kind of warns them about what's going to happen ahead. Right? And he kind of like says, okay, you might get... He doesn't say this overtly, but the character is meant to convey this to the reader. He kind of says to the reader, okay, you're going to be scared during some points of this, but it's okay. It's just a story and you'll get through it. Okay. And in a sense, like when Arnold's hanging on the bottom of a plane and then falls 100 feet into a swamp and gets up and walks, that's the Tom Bombadil moment. That's like, it's going to be okay. Cause like, obviously this ain't that real. So just sit back and enjoy. He didn't fall and break his leg and then wakes up in a hospital with a hyper realistic thing. It's like, It's not like that. It's really is the Superman story made manifest. I don't mean Superman, the superhero. I mean, just a super guy and leading man.
But that's what's funny. We started out by saying just how this movie is not like his others, where he's not a cyborg. He's not from, in the futuristic worlds or anything like that. It's set in, I guess, alternate universe, present day 80s. Yet he is almost more superhuman in the movie than any of his other ones. The Terminator gets brutalized. He does get killed. He gets terminated. Whereas, far less happens to that thing. And then in this one, he gets, he's just fine. He gets in.
I think we tried to count, and I think we got up near 100 or something like that. I forget what the real number was. How many people were killed in this movie? He starts blowing up buildings. It becomes hard to count. But I remember back in the day, me and my roommates were like, right now, there's 1, 2, 3, 4. You might have been one. I don't remember. I think you're right about that for sure.
It's a wild ride, and I've really enjoyed talking to you about it. I could go on for another hour and a half, but I think it's...
Well, Eric, if you'd like me to have me again on the show, I'll be back.
I'll be back. Yeah, that's that joke right there. That's so perfect. But man, I remember the first time I ever saw Terminator, how disappointed I was how he delivers that line, because it became so. Everyone was saying, "Oh, it'd be all dramatic and everything." Like,
Yeah.
and then when you watch
All
it, he
this and
just says it to the guy. He's like, "I'll be back." You know,
Yep.
just 'cause it's not at all what.
All right, I'll see you later.
But whereas to bring things back around for Commando, all the lines in that were delivered perfectly.
All of them.
All of them.
All of them had the appropriate amount of camp to get us to the next scene. They were our Tom Bombadil moments where he said, I mean, even when the first, he kills his first guy in the movie, or one of the first guys, and he goes, if you want to get your daughter back, you're going to have to cooperate, right? What did he say? Yeah. Wrong. Just like, no, that's not what's going to happen. And like, yeah, we don't negotiate with terrorists.
Yeah.
It's
crazy.
Well, yeah, it was great talking with you, Eric. Thanks.
I really appreciate you having me on, and for everybody else listening to us, I hope you enjoyed our conversation about 1985's Commando. Please check out the EPS podcast everywhere you get your podcasts, including, I'm assuming, right where you're listening to it right now. And check us out on Patreon. There's all sorts of things you can get by becoming a Patreon member, including at the lowest tier, a sticker, the second tier, a mug, and the third tier, a t-shirt, all of which say everything's a primary source, because that's what EPS podcast stands for. This is the EPS podcast where everything, including 1985's Commando, is a primary source. We'll talk to you next time.
And if anybody, I haven't really started it up yet, but I'll be starting a Twitch channel soon in the next month or so. So you'll find me on Instagram and Twitter, but especially on Twitch at Professor Hipp.
Thank you very much, Professor Hipp.
Yeah, you got it.
Us, and we'll do it again sometime soon.